The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Blackstone Palace as 10-year-old Prince Alexander hurried through the corridors, his polished shoes echoing against the ancient stones. He was already late for his mathematics lesson, and his tutor, Professor Whitmore, did not tolerate tardiness from anyone, royal blood or otherwise. The young prince's mind raced with excuses, though he knew none would satisfy the stern educator who had been drilling him in arithmetic for the past 3 months. Alexander had always been a spirited child, much like his late mother, Queen Isabella, who had passed away when he was only 6 years old. The palace staff often whispered about how much the boy resembled her, not just in his striking green eyes and auburn hair, but in his fierce independence and quick temper. These traits had served Queen Isabella well during her reign, but in a young prince, they often led to complications that the royal household struggled to manage. The current queen consort, Lady Victoria Ashworth, had married King Edmund 2 years prior, bringing with her a strict sense of protocol and an unwavering belief in traditional royal etiquette. She was a woman of 45, elegant and refined, with silver-streaked dark hair always perfectly arranged and a wardrobe that never showed a wrinkle. Victoria had come from a prominent noble family and understood the weight of royal responsibility, but her relationship with young Alexander had been strained from the beginning. Victoria believed that Alexander needed structure, discipline, and clear boundaries to prepare him for his future role as king. She had implemented numerous changes to his daily routine, including earlier bedtimes, additional study sessions, and stricter rules about his interactions with the palace staff. While King Edmund supported these decisions in public, privately he worried about his son's happiness and the growing tension between Alexander and his new stepmother. The boy's relationship with his father had also become complicated since the remarriage. King Edmund, a man of 50 with graying temples and kind blue eyes, loved his son deeply, but felt torn between his duties as a husband and as a father. He often found himself caught in the middle of disagreements between Victoria and Alexander, trying to maintain peace while ensuring his son felt loved and supported. The weight of the crown seemed heavier these days as Edmund struggled to balance the needs of his kingdom, his new marriage, and his grieving child. Alexander's tutoring sessions had become a particular source of conflict. Victoria insisted on more rigorous academic standards, believing that a future king must excel in all subjects. She had hired additional tutors and extended his study hours, leaving little time for the activities Alexander enjoyed, such as riding his horse, Thunderbolt, or exploring the palace gardens with his best friend, Thomas, the stablemaster's son. Professor Whitmore was a thin, elderly man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a permanent frown etched into his weathered face. He had served as tutor to several generations of royal children and prided himself on his ability to instill discipline and knowledge in even the most reluctant students. However, Alexander presented a unique challenge. The boy was undeniably intelligent, but his attention often wandered, and he frequently questioned the relevance of his lessons to his daily life. As Alexander finally reached the classroom door, he paused to catch his breath and straighten his uniform. The room beyond was filled with afternoon light streaming through tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. He could see Professor Whitmore seated at the large oak desk, his gray head bent over a stack of papers, preparing for the lesson ahead. The sight of mathematical equations and historical texts spread across the desk made Alexander's stomach churn with a familiar sense of dread. The classroom itself was an imposing space, with high ceilings adorned with portraits of previous monarchs and shelves lined with leather-bound books that seemed to watch over every lesson. A large chalkboard dominated one wall, usually covered with complex problems that made Alexander's head spin. The formal atmosphere of the room was intended to inspire respect for learning, but for the young prince, it felt more like a prison where his childhood was slowly being stripped away. Victoria's influence extended beyond just academic requirements. She had also insisted on changes to Alexander's personal staff, replacing several longtime servants with individuals who shared her strict approach to royal protocol. Among these changes was the assignment of a new personal guard, Captain Marcus Sterling, an imposing man in his 30s, with military bearing and an unwavering dedication to following orders precisely. Captain Sterling had served in the Royal Guard for over a decade and was known for his absolute loyalty to the crown and his rigid interpretation of royal security protocols. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, short-cropped brown hair, and sharp hazel eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Victoria had specifically requested his assignment to Alexander, believing that the prince needed a strong male influence who would enforce boundaries and ensure his safety while teaching him proper royal behavior. The captain's approach to his duties was methodical and uncompromising. He accompanied Alexander everywhere, from lessons to meals to recreational activities, always maintaining a respectful but firm presence. While his dedication was admirable, his constant vigilance often made Alexander feel like he was under surveillance rather than protection. The boy longed for the freedom he had known before his father's remarriage, when the palace staff had been more relaxed and understanding of his need for space and independence. Alexander's friendships had also suffered under the new regime. Thomas, the stablemaster's son, had been Alexander's closest companion since early childhood. The two boys had grown up together, exploring every corner of the palace grounds and sharing adventures that helped Alexander maintain some sense of normalcy despite his royal status. However, Victoria viewed this friendship with concern, believing it was inappropriate for a prince to spend so much time with a servant's child. While she had not explicitly forbidden the friendship, Victoria had subtly discouraged it by scheduling more activities and lessons during times when the boys usually played together. She had also suggested that Alexander might benefit from socializing with children from other noble families, young people who could better understand the responsibilities and expectations of royal life. These suggestions felt like criticism of his chosen friend, and Alexander resented the implication that Thomas was somehow unsuitable as a companion. The tension in the palace had been building for months, with small incidents and disagreements creating an atmosphere of unease among the staff and family members alike. Servants whispered in corridors about the changes since Victoria's arrival, while trying to maintain their loyalty to both the new queen and the young prince they had watched grow up. Many of them remembered Queen Isabella fondly and struggled to adapt to Victoria's different style of leadership and expectations. King Edmund had noticed the growing strain but felt uncertain about how to address it effectively. He respected Victoria's intelligence and her genuine desire to prepare Alexander for his future responsibilities, but he also recognized his son's need for understanding and patience as he navigated his grief and adjustment to significant changes in his life. The king often found himself lying awake at night, wondering if he had made the right choices for his family and his kingdom. As Alexander stood outside the classroom door, gathering courage to face another challenging lesson, he could hear the distant sounds of palace life continuing around him. Servants moved quietly through the halls, attending to their daily duties, while guards maintained their posts at strategic locations throughout the building. The familiar sounds that had once brought him comfort now seemed to emphasize his isolation and the growing distance between him and the world he had known before Victoria's arrival. The young prince took a deep breath and reached for the door handle, knowing that Professor Whitmore would be waiting with another series of difficult problems and stern reminders about his royal obligations. He wondered how much longer he could endure this new reality before something inside him finally snapped, and he found himself unable to maintain the careful composure that everyone seemed to expect from him. Little did he know that this very afternoon would bring events that would test his self-control beyond its limits and change the dynamics of his relationship with his stepmother forever. The mathematics lesson proved to be even more challenging than Alexander had anticipated. Professor Whitmore had prepared a series of complex fraction problems that required not only mathematical skill but also sustained concentration, something the young prince found increasingly difficult to maintain. The afternoon sun streaming through the classroom windows created a warm, drowsy atmosphere that made focusing on numbers and calculations nearly impossible. "Your Highness, I asked you to solve for the value of x in this equation," Professor Whitmore said, his voice carrying a note of irritation as he tapped the chalkboard with his wooden pointer. The elderly tutor's patience was wearing thin after watching Alexander stare out the window for the third time in 10 minutes. "Perhaps you could direct your attention to your studies rather than to the gardens?" Alexander forced his gaze back to the chalkboard, where a complicated algebraic equation seemed to mock him with its incomprehensible symbols and numbers. His mind felt foggy, unable to grasp the logical steps needed to solve the problem. The mathematical concepts that came easily to other children his age seemed to slip away from him like water through his fingers, leaving him frustrated and embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Professor," Alexander mumbled, picking up his pencil and attempting to work through the problem. But his thoughts kept drifting to the afternoon he had originally planned to spend with Thomas in the stables, helping to groom the horses and perhaps taking Thunderbolt for a ride through the countryside. Those simple pleasures now seemed like distant memories from a happier time. The lesson continued for another hour, with Professor Whitmore growing increasingly frustrated by Alexander's lack of progress and apparent disinterest in the material. The tutor had taught many royal children over his long career, but none had presented such a combination of intelligence and stubborn resistance to learning. He could see that the boy was capable of understanding the concepts, but some invisible barrier seemed to prevent him from applying himself fully to his studies. When the mathematics session finally ended, Alexander felt exhausted and demoralized. His head ached from trying to concentrate on problems that seemed designed to highlight his inadequacies, and his spirit felt crushed by another afternoon of disappointing his tutor and, by extension, the adults who were trying to shape him into a proper future king. As he gathered his books and papers, Professor Whitmore delivered his usual lecture about the importance of academic excellence for a future monarch. Your Highness must understand that mathematics forms the foundation of logical thinking, which is essential for making sound decisions as a ruler. Your stepmother, Queen Victoria, has specifically emphasized the importance of your progress in this subject. The mention of Victoria made Alexander's jaw tighten with resentment. It seemed that every aspect of his life now required her approval or reflected her expectations. He longed for the days when his education had been more balanced, including physical activities, creative pursuits, and time for the kind of learning that came through exploration and discovery rather than rigid memorization and problem-solving. Captain Sterling was waiting outside the classroom door, as he always was, ready to escort Alexander to his next scheduled activity. The guard's presence had become a constant reminder of how little freedom Alexander now enjoyed. Every movement was monitored. Every deviation from the daily schedule required explanation and often disapproval from the adults who controlled his life. Your Highness, Captain Sterling said with a formal nod, Queen Victoria has requested your presence in the blue drawing room for afternoon tea and etiquette instruction. Lady Margaret will be joining you to review proper conversation skills and dining protocols. Alexander's heart sank at the news. Lady Margaret was Victoria's choice for teaching him social graces, a stern woman in her 60s who believed that royal children should speak only when spoken to, and always maintain perfect posture and impeccable manners. Her lessons felt like performances where Alexander was constantly being judged and found lacking in some subtle way. The blue drawing room was one of the palace's most formal spaces, decorated with priceless antiques and portraits of stern-looking ancestors who seemed to disapprove of any signs of informality or spontaneity. The room's atmosphere always made Alexander feel small and out of place, as if he were an intruder in his own home. As they walked through the palace corridors, Alexander noticed Thomas in the distance carrying a bucket of water toward the stables. His friend looked up and waved briefly before disappearing around a corner, leaving Alexander with a sharp pang of longing for the simple friendship and uncomplicated fun they had shared before Victoria's arrival changed everything. The etiquette lesson proved to be just as challenging as the mathematics session, but in different ways. Lady Margaret had prepared elaborate tea service with multiple courses and specific rules for each type of food and beverage. Alexander was expected to demonstrate proper use of various utensils, maintain appropriate conversation topics, and exhibit the kind of refined behavior that would be expected of him at state functions and diplomatic events. A prince must always remember that he represents the crown in every interaction, Lady Margaret explained, her voice crisp and authoritative. Your posture, your diction, your choice of topics, even the way you hold your teacup, all reflect on the dignity of the royal family and the respect of our subjects. Alexander tried to follow her instructions, but his natural tendency toward informality and spontaneity made the rigid protocols feel artificial and uncomfortable. He accidentally used the wrong fork for his pastry, forgot to wait for Lady Margaret to begin eating before starting his own meal, and committed several other minor infractions that resulted in gentle but persistent corrections. Victoria joined them halfway through the lesson, sweeping into the room with her usual grace and authority. She was dressed in a deep blue afternoon dress that complemented the room's decor perfectly, and her presence immediately elevated the formality of the occasion. Alexander felt his stomach tighten with nervous energy as his stepmother took her place at the tea table. How is our young prince progressing with his social education? Victoria asked Lady Margaret, though her eyes remained fixed on Alexander as she spoke. There was something in her gaze that made him feel as though he were being evaluated and measured against some invisible standard that he could never quite reach. His Highness shows promise, but there are still areas that require significant improvement, Lady Margaret replied diplomatically. Perhaps with more frequent practice sessions, we can help him develop the natural grace that befits his station. The criticism, however gently delivered, stung Alexander deeply. He had been trying his best to meet everyone's expectations, but it seemed that no matter how hard he worked, he always fell short of the standards set for him. The constant pressure to be perfect, to represent the crown with dignity, to suppress his natural personality in favor of royal protocol, was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. As the lesson continued, Victoria began offering her own observations and suggestions for improvement. She pointed out the way Alexander held his shoulders, the tone of his voice when responding to questions, and the appropriateness of his facial expressions during formal conversation. Each comment felt like another weight added to an already overwhelming burden of expectations. Alexander, you must remember that as a future king, people will be watching your every gesture and listening to your every word, Victoria said, her voice patient but firm. The habits you develop now will serve you throughout your life. It's important that we help you build the foundation for successful leadership. The young prince nodded obediently, but inside he felt a growing sense of rebellion against the constant scrutiny and criticism. He missed the days when he could simply be a child, when mistakes were opportunities for learning rather than evidence of inadequacy, when the adults in his life focused on his happiness and well-being rather than his performance as a future monarch. After what felt like hours of instruction and correction, the etiquette lesson finally came to an end. Alexander's head was spinning with rules about proper posture, acceptable conversation topics, and the intricate protocols that governed every aspect of royal behavior. He felt drained and discouraged, wondering if he would ever be able to master all the expectations that seemed to multiply with each passing day. As Lady Margaret gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Victoria remained seated, clearly intending to have a private conversation with Alexander. The prospect of additional instruction or criticism made his heart race with anxiety. He had reached his limit for the day, and he wasn't sure he could maintain his composure through another session of well-intentioned but overwhelming guidance. Alexander, I know these lessons can be challenging, Victoria began, her voice softer than usual, but they're necessary preparation for your future responsibilities. I hope you understand that everything we're asking of you is designed to help you become the best possible leader for our people. The young prince looked at his stepmother, seeing genuine concern in her eyes but also the unwavering determination that characterized all her decisions regarding his education and upbringing. He wanted to tell her how overwhelmed he felt, how much he missed his old life, how desperately he needed some space to just be a 10-year-old boy. But the words seemed impossible to say in this formal setting, under the watchful gaze of portraits depicting generations of successful monarchs who had somehow managed to master all these same challenges. The afternoon grew late as Victoria continued her conversation with Alexander in the blue drawing room. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows had shifted from bright gold to the softer amber hues that signaled the approaching evening. Despite the beautiful light and the elegant surroundings, the atmosphere in the room felt heavy with unspoken tension and accumulated frustration. I've been thinking about your progress, Alexander, Victoria said, settling back in her chair with the confident air of someone who had made important decisions. Your tutors have expressed some concerns about your focus and dedication to your studies. Professor Whitmore mentioned that you seem distracted during mathematics lessons, and Lady Margaret feels that you're not taking your etiquette training seriously enough. Alexander felt his cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. The criticisms weren't entirely unfair, but hearing them delivered so matter-of-factly by his stepmother made them feel like personal attacks on his character, rather than observations about his academic performance. He struggled to find the right words to respond without saying something that would make the situation worse. I am trying my best, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, but he couldn't think of any other way to defend himself against the mounting evidence of his apparent failures as a student and future king. Victoria's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm.
I know you're trying, Alexander, but trying isn't enough when you're preparing to lead a nation.
Your father and I have decided that some changes need to be made to help you reach your full potential. Starting tomorrow, we'll be extending your study hours and adding additional sessions with specialized tutors who can help address your specific weaknesses. The news hit Alexander like a physical blow. More study hours meant even less time for the activities he enjoyed, less opportunity to spend time with Thomas, and fewer moments of freedom in his already highly structured days. The prospect of additional tutors bringing their own sets of expectations and criticisms felt overwhelming. "We're also going to implement a new reward system," Victoria continued, pulling out a leather-bound notebook filled with her careful handwriting. "Good performance in your lessons will earn you privileges, while poor performance will result in restricted activities. This should help motivate you to take your education more seriously." Alexander stared at the notebook, realizing that his stepmother had been planning these changes for some time. Every aspect of his life was apparently being evaluated and reorganized according to her vision of what a proper royal education should look like. The thought of earning or losing privileges based on his academic performance made him feel like a prisoner rather than a prince. "What kind of restricted activities?" he asked, though he dreaded hearing the answer. "Well, for instance, time in the stables would need to be earned through excellent marks in mathematics and history," Victoria explained, consulting her notes. "Recreational riding would be contingent on satisfactory progress in your language studies, and social time with the staff children would require demonstrated improvement in your etiquette and protocol lessons." The mention of restrictions on his time with Thomas felt like the final straw. Alexander's friendship with the stablemaster's son was one of the few sources of genuine joy left in his life, and the idea that it could be taken away based on his performance in subjects that felt meaningless to him sparked a fierce protective anger in his young heart. "That's not fair," Alexander said, his voice stronger now despite the tremor of emotion running through it. "Thomas is my best friend. You can't use our friendship as a reward or punishment." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly at the unexpected defiance in her stepson's voice. She had grown accustomed to his quiet compliance, even when she could see his reluctance to accept her decisions. This direct challenge to her authority was something new, and it required a firm response. "Alexander, you need to understand that every aspect of your life must serve the goal of preparing you for kingship," she said, her tone becoming cooler and more authoritative. "Friendships, recreational activities, even your free time, all of these are privileges that must be balanced against your responsibilities to your future subjects." The young prince felt something inside him begin to crack under the pressure of constant expectations and restrictions. The grief he still carried for his mother, the confusion about his changing relationship with his father, and the overwhelming burden of royal protocols all seemed to converge in this moment of confrontation with his stepmother. "My mother never made me choose between being a prince and being a child," Alexander said, his voice rising despite his efforts to control it. "She understood that I needed both to become a good king." The reference to Queen Isabella brought a flash of something sharp and painful to Victoria's eyes. She had always struggled with comparisons to Alexander's beloved mother, knowing that she could never replace the special bond they had shared. These comparisons felt like challenges to her authority and reminders of her outsider status in the family. "Your mother lived in different times, Alexander," Victoria replied, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an edge of steel. "The world has changed, and the expectations for royal leadership have evolved. What might have been adequate preparation 20 years ago is no longer sufficient in today's political climate." Alexander felt tears of frustration beginning to sting his eyes, but he was determined not to let his stepmother see him cry. The conversation had moved beyond academic concerns into deeper territory, involving his memories of his mother and his understanding of what it meant to be royal. These were sacred spaces that he wasn't willing to surrender without a fight. "She was a great queen," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion but firm with conviction. "Everyone loved her, and she never had to take away people's friendships to make them respect her." Victoria stood up abruptly, her composure finally showing signs of strain under the emotional weight of the conversation. She had tried to be patient and understanding with Alexander, but his continued resistance to her guidance and his pointed comparisons to his mother were testing the limits of her diplomatic approach. "Alexander, this conversation has gone far enough," she said, moving toward the door. "You will follow the new schedule we've established, and you will do so with the respect and obedience that your position demands. Captain Sterling will escort you to your chambers, where you can spend the evening reflecting on your responsibilities." The dismissal felt final and harsh, leaving no room for further discussion or negotiation. Alexander realized that his attempt to defend his friendship with Thomas and honor his mother's memory had only made his situation worse. The new restrictions would go into effect regardless of his feelings about them, and his emotional outburst had probably convinced Victoria that even stricter measures were necessary. As Victoria reached the door, she paused and turned back to face her stepson. "I'm doing this because I care about your future, Alexander. I know it's difficult to understand now, but someday you'll thank me for pushing you to excel." The door closed behind her with a soft but definitive click, leaving Alexander alone in the blue drawing room, with his churning emotions and the growing realization that his life was spiraling further and further away from anything resembling happiness or normalcy. The portraits of his ancestors seemed to watch him with judgment and expectation, reminding him of the weight of tradition and duty that pressed down on his young shoulders. Captain Sterling appeared in the doorway moments later, his professional demeanor unchanged despite the obvious tension that had filled the room during the conversation between Alexander and Victoria. The guard's loyalty was to the crown and to following orders, not to managing the emotional needs of a distressed 10-year-old boy. "Your Highness," Captain Sterling said formally, "I'm to escort you to your chambers for the evening. Dinner will be served privately in your room tonight, and you're expected to use the time for reflection and preparation for tomorrow's enhanced study schedule." The walk to his chambers felt like a march to prison. Alexander's mind raced with thoughts of rebellion and escape, but he knew that any attempt to defy the new rules would only result in even stricter supervision and more severe restrictions. He felt trapped in a life that seemed designed to eliminate every source of joy and spontaneity that made him feel human. As they walked through the palace corridors, Alexander caught glimpses of the normal evening routines continuing around him. Servants were preparing for dinner service. Guards were changing shifts, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of laughter from the kitchen staff as they went about their work. The contrast between their apparent contentment and his own misery made his isolation feel even more complete. When they reached his chambers, Captain Sterling delivered his final instructions for the evening. "Your Highness, Queen Victoria has requested that you spend this time considering the importance of your education and the sacrifices that everyone is making to ensure your success. She hopes that tomorrow will bring a renewed commitment to excellence in all your endeavors." The door closed, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that something had to change. He couldn't continue living under the crushing weight of constant supervision, endless criticism, and the gradual elimination of everything that brought meaning and happiness to his life. As he stared out his window at the gardens where he and Thomas had shared so many adventures, he began to formulate a plan that would test the limits of everyone's patience and potentially change the dynamics of his relationship with his stepmother forever. The next morning dawned gray and cloudy, matching Alexander's mood as he prepared to face the first day of Victoria's enhanced educational program. He had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and thinking about the conversation in the blue drawing room. The new restrictions felt like chains around his spirit, and the prospect of earning basic privileges through academic performance made him feel more like a trained animal than a future king. Breakfast was served in his chambers, another sign of his diminished status within the household. Previously, family meals had been times of relative relaxation and connection with his father, but now even those simple pleasures were being regulated according to Victoria's vision of proper royal development. Alexander picked at his food, his appetite suppressed by anxiety and resentment. Captain Sterling arrived precisely at 8 o'clock to escort Alexander to his first lesson of the day, which was now an extended mathematics session with Professor Whitmore. The elderly tutor had been briefed on the new expectations and was prepared to implement a more rigorous curriculum designed to address Alexander's apparent weaknesses in logical thinking and problem-solving. "Good morning, Your Highness," Professor Whitmore said as they entered the classroom. "I trust you're prepared for a more intensive approach to your mathematical education. Queen Victoria has emphasized the importance of measurable progress, so we'll be implementing regular testing and detailed progress reports." The prospect of constant testing made Alexander's stomach churn with nervousness. He had always struggled with the pressure of formal evaluation, preferring to learn through exploration and discovery rather than through the anxiety-inducing process of proving his knowledge under scrutiny. The new system seemed designed to highlight his failures rather than encourage his natural curiosity and intelligence. The mathematics lesson proved to be even more challenging than Alexander had feared. Professor Whitmore had prepared advanced problems that pushed the boundaries of the young prince's understanding, and the constant pressure to perform correctly made it difficult for him to think clearly or apply the knowledge he did possess. Every mistake was noted and discussed, creating an atmosphere of judgment that made learning feel impossible. Your Highness, you must focus more intently on the logical progression of mathematical concepts, Professor Whitmore said after Alexander struggled with a particularly complex algebraic equation. Queen Victoria has made it clear that excellence in mathematics is fundamental to your development as a future leader. Perhaps if you applied yourself with greater determination, these concepts would become clearer. The criticism, while delivered in the professor's usual measured tone, felt like another indictment of Alexander's character and capabilities. He wanted to explain that the pressure and constant evaluation were making it harder for him to concentrate, but he knew that such explanations would be dismissed as excuses rather than legitimate concerns about his learning environment. When the mathematics session finally ended, Alexander felt exhausted and demoralized. His head ached from trying to concentrate under pressure, and his confidence in his own abilities had been further undermined by the morning's struggles. The prospect of facing similar challenges in his other subjects throughout the day felt overwhelming. Captain Sterling escorted him to his next session, which was an expanded language lesson with a new tutor, Madame Dubois, a stern Frenchwoman who specialized in preparing royal children for international diplomatic communications. Victoria had specifically requested her services, believing that Alexander needed more rigorous training in foreign languages to prepare him for his future role in international relations. Madame Dubois proved to be even more demanding than Professor Whitmore. She expected perfect pronunciation, flawless grammar, and sophisticated vocabulary that challenged Alexander's existing language skills. The lesson was conducted entirely in French, leaving him struggling to understand instructions while simultaneously trying to demonstrate competency in a language he was still learning. Non, Your Highness," Madame Dubois said, her accent thick with disapproval as she corrected Alexander's pronunciation for the third time. "The tongue must be positioned correctly for the proper sound. Again, s'il vous plaît." Alexander repeated the phrase, but his nervousness made his accent even more pronounced, drawing another round of corrections from the demanding tutor. He could feel his frustration building with each failed attempt to meet her exacting standards. The constant criticism was eroding his willingness to try, creating a cycle of failure and discouragement that made learning feel impossible. The language lesson was followed by an additional etiquette session with Lady Margaret, who had prepared an even more comprehensive curriculum covering diplomatic protocol, formal correspondence, and the intricate rules governing royal behavior in various social situations. The session felt like an extension of the previous day's training, but with added complexity and higher expectations. "Your Highness," Lady Margaret said as she arranged an elaborate place setting that included multiple forks, knives, and glasses, "today we'll be practicing the protocols for state dinners and diplomatic receptions. Every movement, every gesture, every word must reflect the dignity and sophistication expected of a future monarch." Alexander stared at the bewildering array of utensils and tried to remember the complex rules governing their use. The formal dining protocol seemed designed to create opportunities for failure, rather than to facilitate genuine communication and connection with others. He wondered how his mother had managed to navigate these requirements while still maintaining her warmth and accessibility to the people she served. As the day progressed through one demanding lesson after another, Alexander felt his emotional reserves being steadily depleted. The constant pressure to perform, the endless corrections and criticisms, and the growing distance between his current reality and any semblance of childhood normalcy were creating a perfect storm of frustration and rebellion within his young heart. The final lesson of the day was a new addition to his curriculum, a session on royal history and constitutional law with Dr. Pemberton, a distinguished scholar who had been recruited specifically to address what Victoria perceived as gaps in Alexander's understanding of his future responsibilities. The elderly academic had prepared a comprehensive overview of monarchical duties and constitutional requirements that would govern Alexander's eventual reign. "Your Highness," Dr. Pemberton began, adjusting his spectacles as he opened a thick leather-bound volume, "it's essential that you understand the historical precedents and legal frameworks that define royal authority in our modern constitutional monarchy. Queen Victoria has emphasized the importance of this knowledge for your future effectiveness as a ruler." The mention of his stepmother's involvement in yet another aspect of his education sparked a fresh wave of resentment in Alexander's chest. It seemed that every lesson, every expectation, every criticism could be traced back to Victoria's vision of what he should become. He felt like he was being systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to someone else's specifications, with no regard for his own thoughts, feelings, or natural inclinations. Dr. Pemberton launched into a detailed explanation of constitutional principles and historical precedents, his voice taking on the dry, academic tone that made even the most fascinating historical events sound boring and irrelevant. Alexander tried to listen and take notes, but his mind kept wandering to thoughts of escape and rebellion against the suffocating structure that his life had become. As the lesson dragged on, Alexander's patience finally reached its breaking point. The cumulative effect of a day filled with criticism, pressure, and impossible expectations had worn down his usual reserve and good manners. When Dr. Pemberton paused to ask him a question about parliamentary procedure, Alexander found himself unable to provide the expected response. "I don't know," Alexander said, his voice carrying a note of defiance that surprised even himself. "I don't know the answer, and I don't care about parliamentary procedure, or constitutional law, or any of the other things that everyone keeps telling me I have to learn." Dr. Pemberton's eyebrows rose in shock at the unprecedented display of royal defiance. In his decades of teaching, he had never encountered such direct resistance from a member of the royal family. The breach of protocol was so unexpected that he wasn't sure how to respond appropriately. "Your Highness." Dr. First Day. Pemberton said carefully, "I understand that these subjects can be challenging, but they're fundamental to your future role as king. Perhaps we should take a brief recess and continue when you're feeling more receptive to learning." But Alexander was beyond the point where a simple break could restore his composure. The morning's accumulated frustrations, the pressure of constant evaluation, and the suffocating sense of being controlled and managed had finally overwhelmed his ability to maintain the facade of compliance that everyone expected from him. "I don't want a recess," Alexander said, his voice rising with emotion. "I want everyone to stop trying to turn me into someone I'm not. I want to spend time with my friend Thomas without having to earn it through test scores. I want to learn about things that actually interest me instead of just memorizing facts that make adults think I'm being properly educated." The outburst seemed to surprise Alexander as much as it shocked Dr. Pemberton. For months, he had been suppressing his true feelings about the changes in his life, trying to be the obedient and dedicated student that Victoria expected him to be. But the pressure had finally become too great, and his honest emotions were spilling out in a way that he could no longer control. Captain Sterling, who had been standing quietly by the door throughout the lesson, stepped forward with a concerned expression. The guard's training had prepared him to handle many types of security threats, but managing the emotional breakdown of a distressed 10-year-old prince was outside his usual area of expertise. Captain Sterling stepped forward as Alexander's emotional outburst continued to intensify. The guard's military training had taught him to assess threats and maintain order, but the sight of the young prince breaking down under the weight of accumulated pressure presented a challenge he hadn't anticipated. His first instinct was to restore calm and prevent the situation from escalating further. "Your Highness," Captain Sterling said in his most authoritative voice, "you need to control yourself and show proper respect to Dr. Pemberton. This behavior is unacceptable for a member of the royal family." The guard's intervention, intended to restore order, had the opposite effect on Alexander. The formal reprimand felt like another attempt to suppress his feelings and force him back into the role of the perfect, obedient prince that everyone seemed determined to create. His frustration with the entire system of control and expectation finally found a target in the imposing figure who had become the symbol of his lost freedom. "Don't tell me how to behave," Alexander shouted, his voice cracking with emotion as months of suppressed anger finally erupted. "You're not my father, and you don't get to decide what's acceptable for me." Dr. Pemberton gathered his materials quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the unprecedented breakdown of royal protocol occurring in his presence. The elderly scholar had taught constitutional law for decades, but nothing in his academic experience had prepared him for this kind of raw emotional confrontation with royal authority and expectation. Captain Sterling maintained his professional composure, but Alexander could see uncertainty in the guard's eyes. The man was trained to follow orders and maintain security, but the current situation required skills in child psychology and emotional support that weren't part of his military background. His next words revealed the limitations of his approach to dealing with distressed children. "Your Highness, Queen Victoria has given me specific instructions about maintaining proper behavior during your lessons," Captain Sterling said, his voice remaining steady despite the chaos of the moment. "I'm going to need you to calm down and return to your studies immediately." The mention of Victoria's instructions was like striking a match near gunpowder. Alexander's face flushed red with rage as he realized that even this guard's responses to his emotional crisis had been predetermined by his stepmother. Every aspect of his life, including his moments of greatest distress, was apparently subject to her control and management. "I don't care what she told you," Alexander screamed, his voice echoing through the classroom and likely carrying into the adjacent corridors where palace staff were going about their daily routines. "Victoria is not my mother, and she doesn't get to control everything I do and say and feel." The words hung in the air like an accusation and a declaration of war. Alexander had finally spoken the truth that had been burning in his heart for months, that he resented Victoria's authority over his life and refused to accept her attempts to replace his beloved mother's memory and influence. Captain Sterling's expression hardened as he realized that the situation had moved beyond a simple disciplinary matter into territory that threatened the stability of the royal household. The guard's loyalty was ultimately to the crown and to maintaining order within the palace, and Alexander's open rebellion against Queen Victoria's authority represented a challenge that couldn't be ignored or minimized. "That's enough, Your Highness," Captain Sterling said, his voice taking on a tone of absolute authority. "You will not speak about Queen Victoria in that manner, and you will not continue this disrespectful outburst. I'm going to escort you to your chambers immediately where you can reflect on your behavior." Alexander felt a surge of panic at the prospect of being locked away in his room while the adults in his life decided how to punish him for finally expressing his honest feelings. The thought of Captain Sterling physically compelling him to comply with orders he found unjust triggered a desperate need to assert some control over his own fate. "You can't make me go anywhere," Alexander declared, backing away from the guard and positioning himself near the classroom's tall windows. "I'm the prince, and someday I'll be king, and then I won't have to listen to any of you." The claim to royal authority, coming from a 10-year-old boy in the midst of an emotional breakdown, would have been almost comical under different circumstances. But Captain Sterling recognized the serious implications of allowing a member of the royal family to defy direct orders and challenge the established hierarchy that maintained order within the palace. "Your Highness," Captain Sterling said, taking a step closer to Alexander, "your future role as king is exactly why you need to learn proper behavior and respect for authority now. I'm going to escort you to your chambers, and we're going to do it calmly and with dignity." Alexander could see that the guard was preparing to physically remove him from the classroom if necessary. The prospect of being manhandled and carried away like a misbehaving child felt like the ultimate humiliation after a day filled with failures and criticisms. His desperate need to maintain some shred of autonomy and self-respect drove him to make one final defiant stand. "Don't touch me!" Alexander shouted as Captain Sterling moved closer. "I said you're not my father, and I meant it. You're not my family, you don't care about me, and you don't get to put your hands on me." At that moment, Victoria appeared in the classroom doorway, drawn by the sounds of the commotion that had disrupted the usually quiet academic atmosphere of the palace. Her arrival immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation, as all eyes turned to the elegant figure who had unknowingly become the focus of Alexander's rebellion. Victoria's expression showed shock and concern as she took in the scene. Her stepson in a state of obvious emotional distress, Dr. Pemberton looking uncomfortable and out of his depth, and Captain Sterling positioned as if preparing to physically restrain the young prince. The situation was clearly far more serious than the typical academic struggles she had been trying to address through enhanced tutoring and stricter expectations. "Alexander, what on earth is happening here?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying both authority and genuine worry as she stepped into the room. She could see that her stepson was beyond the point of rational discussion, but her instinct was still to try to restore order through calm, authoritative intervention. The sight of his stepmother triggered a fresh wave of anger and resentment in Alexander's chest. All the accumulated frustration of the day, all the months of feeling controlled and manipulated, all the grief and confusion about his changing family situation came pouring out in a torrent of words that he had been holding back for far too long. "You're not my mother!" Alexander screamed, his voice breaking with emotion as he finally spoke the words that had been burning in his heart. "You're not my mother, and you never will be. And I hate the way you're trying to change everything about my life." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, revealing the depth of resentment and pain that had been building in her stepson despite her efforts to help him develop into a capable future king. She had known that their relationship was strained, but she hadn't fully understood the extent to which Alexander viewed her guidance as an attack on his identity and his connection to his deceased mother. Victoria's face went pale as she absorbed the full impact of Alexander's declaration. She had genuinely believed that her efforts to improve his education and preparation for kingship were acts of love and responsibility, but it was now clear that he experienced them as attempts to erase his mother's influence and impose her own vision of what he should become. "Alexander," Victoria said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual confidence and authority, "I never wanted to replace your mother. I only wanted to help you succeed." But Alexander was beyond the point where explanations or reassurances could reach him. The emotional dam had burst, and all the pain and confusion of the past 2 years came flooding out in a continuation of his desperate cry for understanding and autonomy. "Well, I don't want your help," Alexander sobbed, tears now streaming down his face as the full weight of his isolation and frustration overwhelmed him. "I want my mother back, and I want my old life back. And I want everyone to stop trying to turn me into someone she wouldn't even recognize." The raw honesty of his words created a moment of stunned silence in the classroom. Dr. Pemberton quietly slipped out, recognizing that he had no role to play in what had become a deeply personal family crisis. Captain Sterling remained at attention, uncertain whether his security responsibilities required him to intervene or step back from what was clearly an emotional rather than a physical threat to royal stability. Victoria stood frozen, finally understanding that her well-intentioned efforts to prepare Alexander for kingship had been experienced by him as an assault on his identity and his treasured memories of his mother. The realization that she had inadvertently caused such pain to a child she genuinely cared about left her struggling to find words that could begin to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Alexander continued to cry, his small body shaking with the force of emotions that had been suppressed for too long. In that moment, he wasn't a prince or a future king, but simply a 10-year-old boy who missed his mother and felt overwhelmed by expectations he couldn't meet and didn't understand. The confrontation had stripped away all the formal protocols and revealed the human cost of the royal pressures that surrounded him. The future of their relationship, and perhaps the entire royal household, hung in the balance as Victoria struggled to find a way to respond to her stepson's pain with the wisdom and compassion that the moment demanded.